the rest of your classmates who weren't able to tune in tonight for one reason or another. I really like it when people do join for the session. I do this in this course and in the summer course, which is the developmental disabilities class. And if you haven't taken that class yet, I will probably see you this summer because it's on the degree plan for the diagnosticians and probably for those of you who are in the on the special ed track. But I try to do a weekly webinar in both of these classes for our master's students. And it's really fun, I think, if you can tune in when we have the meeting so that you can be part of the discussion. I try to talk about what's coming up in the next week. And also it's fun to kind of bounce ideas off of other people and see what's happening at other schools around the region and what's happening in the field. And sometimes I'll bring in a guest speaker and we get to ask, good questions of people that are experts. But like I said a few minutes ago, I'm going to have the other Dr. Cavan with me all semester because he's kind of trapped at the house with me and he can't escape. And actually right now we're in two different locations. I'm over in Dallas helping with my mom who's had a stroke. Actually, she's had 2 strokes and she's at my sister's house right now getting some extra care over here. And my sister's working this week at the Apparel Mart in Dallas. And so while she's doing some intensive work away from the house, I'm giving some relief with care with my mom. And so Clark's at home at our house in Fort Worth, and I'm over here in Dallas. And so we're in 2 different locations, but most of the time I'll be upstairs and he'll be downstairs the rest of the semester. And we'll tag team on this. And the reason I want to involve him, like I said a little bit earlier, is because behavior is his area of expertise. We actually met at the University of North Texas while we were working on our doctoral degrees. My area of specialization is evaluation, mostly learning disabilities and evaluation, but that side of things and evaluating for learning disabilities, but all types of evaluation. And that's why I trained the diagnosticians here at Tarleton and did that training at the Education Service Center Region 11 before I ever came to Tarleton. But Clark was studying at UNT at the same time with Dr. Lyndall Bullock in the program there for emotional and behavioral disorders. And so we were on 2 different sides of the special ed doctoral program, but we had a lot of overlap. And so we had a number of classes together and we met there and then ended up having that little spark of love later on. But when we both went through sad and divorces, isn't that correct? Isn't that the way it happened?
You said a little spark of love.
Oh, it was a great, huge.
It was bigger than that.
Oh, it's huge. It's a huge spark of love. That's right. But anyway, we have different areas of expertise, but we share this passion for special education. Now, Clark's area of expertise is one that is not mine at all. I did teach behavior in a behavior classroom for about 5 minutes. Actually, it lasted 3 days. I taught in a behavior class for 3 days, and that was all I could handle. And I turned in my resignation. And so I can teach this class, but all I can tell you is, what not to do. So Rachel, you need to mute or sign off of one of your, there we go. Perfect. So Clark can tell you all the things to do. He has taught behavior and he has taught about behavior. He's taught the behavior classes. He has taught a lot of kids with emotional disturbance. He has taught about this at, like I said, numerous universities over the last almost 20 years since you have had your doctorate for 20 years, 22 years. He finished in 2000. And so I'm gonna let him do a whole lot of the teaching and instruction, and I'll kind of navigate the course, but he's going to do a lot of our webinars because I really defer to him on his expertise. Interestingly, he presently is teaching behavior again. After a bit of respite in his career, he's back to doing behavior. He's serving as the behavior interventionist for the Parker County Special Ed Co-op. And so he is in the throes of it right now, doing behavior stuff all the time. And so we had he came home one day this week talking about things that were happening in his work. And I said, okay, that's something you've got to tell the behavior class on Wednesday. And so he's got lots of, current real life experiences that I want him to share. So we talked about doing kind of a tag team, Q&A from me to him. But I think what we may do is I may just kind of turn it over to him right now and let him talk a little bit about what he wants to talk about. And then as I come up with questions, then I may bounce those back off of him. So how's that sound, Clark? Does that work for you?
Whatever.
Okay.
Sure.
Why don't you just kind of take it for right now?
Okay.
I don't want to go over an hour. Okay. So we're going to stop at 8 no matter what.
All right.
Okay.
So my background, basically, I was a youth director in a church and the head football coach for Western Hills High School went to our church, and he asked me if I would start acting as team chaplain for the team back when you could, say a prayer. And I was doing that, and then saw him one day and he's like, man, I need some coaches. How far are you from a degree? And I was like, I have a degree, it's just not in education. So he said, well, see what you'd have to do to get that. So I contacted Region 11, their alternative certification program. And then I went over and talked to the people at TCU, and they were just starting their Masters of Special Ed program. So they said, we'll pay for 2/3 of your tuition. And I said, sign me up. And then they said, you can also do it at the master's level, where if you decide to go on and get a master's, then you'll be that far ahead. So I did that and eventually got my master's there in what was then serious emotional disturbance. It's just emotional disturbance now, but it used to be serious. And after that, they said, well, actually the next semester is when I started teaching at TCU. So I started teaching 96, I guess, at TCU. And then I started the doctoral program up at North Texas in a program called Leadership and Behavior Disorders. And so I'm actually a doctor of bad behavior. And I have major in special education and a minor in educational administration. So during all that time, I was teaching at Western Hills in a class called extended day treatment. What they did was take the 10 worst behaved special ed kids from the entire district and bus them to one location, and that was my room. So it was me, it was a paraprofessional, and then we had a social worker who was employed by the Lena Pope Home, which was, used to be an orphanage, and then it became more of a child services, psychiatric, that kind of services. And so there were the 3 of us and up to 10 kids in this classroom. It was scary. It was real scary at first. And in fact, the day before I was supposed to go to work, I had a dream that I was being held by my feet over an alligator pit. And that was kind of prophetic, kind of showing how worried I was about the whole deal. But I got in there, and the principal told me, look, as soon as there's an opening somewhere else, I'll get you out of here. And then the assistant principal came over to me and put his arm around me and he said, if you can keep the doors on the hinges and bloodshed to a minimum, you'll be doing better than the last guy. So expectations were not that high. And I got in there and just fell in love with the kids. I would have stuck with it longer, but I got tired of the adults I had to mess with. But the kids were fun. And unfortunately, 2 of my kids are now serving life terms for murder in the state of Texas. So that's the kind of kids that I dealt with. I had a kid that came to school one day, and he was a very, very black kid, and he was wearing a thin white t-shirt. And as he came in, you could tell he had bandages on his back. You could see them through the t-shirt. And I said, Rashad, what happened to your back? He said, well, I got shot. And he had actually been involved in a drive-by shooting. And he had ducked, so these bullets grazed his back instead of killing him. And I said, why are you at school? He said, what's the safest place? Because he knew that the people who had shot at him knew that who he was. And so he figured that the safest place he could be was in my classroom. So that's the kind of kids that I started off working with. And after spending 9 years at Western Hills, finished my doctorate, I got my administrative certification, and I went down to Joshua, and I was a assistant principal at the middle school, and then principal of Staples Elementary, and then principal of the middle school. We got that school to exemplary, which is real tough for a middle school. And then they ran me off because that's what Joshua does. Anyway, not bitter or anything, but anyway, I left there and I was out in the real world for a while, almost 10 years. And the company that I was working for, we had I was the vice president of operations for a company, and the main thing we did was clean railroad tank cars. So we employed a lot of people who were fresh out of prison because it was very difficult, hard work. And those guys would, once we hired one of them through a employment service, then he started telling his friends. So I ended up working with the adults of the kids I used to have in school. It was in Oklahoma, and we were doing good work. I felt like we were, making money for the boss and helping some guys turn their lives around. And then the oil crashed, and then the COVID came, and our company ended up basically shutting down. So I was like, what do I do now? And I got a call from Benbrook Middle High School just up the road here. And I taught English, honors English. So it was the opposite end of the spectrum from where I had been with special education, but it's what they needed. And then this year I began in January with the special ed co-op in Parker County. So I'm working with the DAPs. Today I started my day at Peaster DAP, and then I went to Millsap DAP, and then I went to the high school at Brock. So hit those 3 campuses today, and working with students and working with teachers on how to work with the students. So that's kind of my background. And I'll see, is this going to let me share, Lisa? Looks like it.
I hope it will. Will it? Yeah.
Looks like it. So now if I can get here. Y'all see that?
Yeah.
Module 1?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So getting into the definition of an emotional disturbance, it's pretty weird under IDEA. A condition exhibiting one or more of the following characteristics over a long period of time and to a marked degree that adversely affects a child's education performance, an inability to learn that cannot be explained by intellectual, sensory, or health factors. So you've got to rule out an intellectual disability, vision, hearing, all those sorts of things, an inability to build or maintain satisfactory interpersonal relationships with peers and teachers. It's kind of interesting how that came about, because one student, the parents argued he's not building interpersonal relationships with other peers, but he was building great relationships with the teachers. He just didn't like kids his own age. So they added the teacher part there. Inappropriate types of behavior or feelings under normal circumstances, general pervasive mood of unhappiness or depression. And that's not, my grandmother died and I'm sad for a while. Am I here?
Yeah, but you're gonna have to share your screen again, I think.
Man,
I guess you were getting a phone call.
yeah, I got a phone call.
And it knocked you off.
Am I back?
Yeah. Mhm.
All right. This is where you have a general pervasive mood of unhappiness or depression that goes beyond the time, certainly if your grandmother dies or something like that, you're gonna be sad for a little bit, but this is just a general long-term mood like that. Tendency to develop physical symptoms or fears associated with personal or school problems. And then this is the really only a government thing could do this. As defined by IDEA, emotional disturbances include schizophrenia, but it does not apply to children who are socially maladjusted unless it is determined that they have an emotional disturbance. So you have an emotional disturbance unless you're socially maladjusted, unless, of course, that's because of an emotional disturbance. So good old government keeps that all clear for us. So how do we identify students who have an emotional
Wait.
disturbance?
I'm sorry.
Yes,
Confused by that? What does that mean?
if we knew that, it would make life a whole bunch easier.
Okay, I thought I was the only one not getting it.
No, no,
That's
no.
confusing to everyone else.
Yeah, it's kind of a cyclical definition that you can't have a social maladjustment. And what they mean by social maladjustment is, you're a brat. Unless,
Right.
of course, being a brat is caused by the emotional disturbance. So it's convoluted. And in fact, this next piece we're going to look at is convoluted as well. When you look
Yikes.
at that second bullet, the assessment of emotional behavioral disturbance for educational purposes using techniques and procedures is considered the practice of psychology. So the long and the short of that is you've got to have the full ARD committee, but the only person that really matters on that committee is the psychologist or psychiatrist, because they're the only one that can say this is an emotional disturbance. So yeah, it is a weird definition and a strange way that they're identified. Y'all that are going to be diagnosticians, you will be part of this committee, but and you're welcome to state your opinion, but it's really not going to matter. So I wanted to look at special education in Texas, and we'll look specifically at some of the ED stuff, but just overall, you see there was a drop in about 2008, 2007, 2008. Lisa, you want to tell us why that was?
I'm not sure what you're talking about. Where are you talking about?
Well, I'll go on then. I thought you'd want your opportunity to jump on this.
Well, as
But I
soon as I
can't
know
see
what you're
y'all's
talking about,
faces.
as soon as I know what you're talking about, I might want to jump in. So
Okay.
give me-
The state of Texas started telling districts that they could have no more than X% of their kids qualify for special education. So everybody started trying to dump kids who really did qualify for special education to get under that quota that the district set. I mean, that the state set. So the numbers dropped. And now with the COVID and everything else that's gone on, I don't know if the state has dropped their quota or what's going on with it, but you can see they're on the rise again. And when you can go ahead.
well, not only did they drop the quota, they were sued by a number of
That's
districts about that. And the US Department of Ed intervened and forced TEA to drop that. And it was not so much it wasn't a quota. The TEA had told districts that they had a target of 8.5%. And you can see what the average was there in when districts were finally trying to get to it there at 2013-14. The target didn't go away until just a couple of 3 years, about 3 or 4 years ago in 18-19. And that's when the numbers started, really trending back up. when those lawsuits were filed and the US Department of Ed intervened and said, you can't tell districts that they have to meet a quota. Not a quota, you have to meet a target. And if you don't meet a target, we're going to come in and penalize you. If you don't have a target within this range, within just a couple of percentage points of 8.5% of your population in special ed. And so they've removed that target now, and numbers are going back to probably a more appropriate number where they really should rest, which is more like that 12% that you see way back there in 01, 02. That's
So
probably a more
the
appropriate number.
8.5%, where did that number come from? I had heard they just picked it. Was that an actual
Probably
valid
heard that
number?
from me. I tend to say, well, I don't say it very nicely. I say, I turn to the side and make a motion out of my rear end, and say they probably pulled it out of somebody's backside, because that's about as logical as it is. That's the only, I don't know, because a lot of really crazy things come out of TEA. And some of and I tell you all this, those of you who are in my program know that my daughter now works at TEA. And so I say that with that in place, knowing that my daughter works at TEA, and still a lot of really ridiculous things come out of TEA, and have for years. I think I hope that they're getting a little bit better, but still some really ridiculous things come out of there, things that have no basis in rational thought. And for years, they've had people working there who don't have a teaching background, that don't have a background in special ed, making special ed decisions. And so I figure it was probably some pencil pusher, some number cruncher, somebody like that said, oh, wait a minute, this is contradictory to our calculation of this particular formula, or this might get us in trouble with our calculation for our federal dollars or something like that. And somebody just didn't put it all together and came up with this notion that we can force people into this box. Well, like I say to my diagnostician classes, when you start telling people that they have to hit a target or they're going to be penalized, what do they start doing? They start fudging. And they start saying, oh, okay, well, then we're not going to let some kids in that need to qualify, or we're going to put too many kids in that don't qualify in order to meet a target. And that's a bad thing to do, because when you tell teachers or educators in general, you've got to do something or else you're going to be punished. We know the consequences of punishment as educators, and we don't like it. And so we'll do whatever we can to avoid that punishment, as most people will. So Clark,
Yeah, I don't know where it came from, but clearly whoever made that has never seen the normal curve.
No.
So when we look at the breakdown, and these are 2020 numbers, by the way, when we look at the breakdown in the state of Texas, this is how it plays out percentage-wise. And you can see that emotional disturbance is at 6.1%. Overall, about a third of the kids who we serve in special ed have a learning disability. What's interesting is before 1990, autism fell under emotional disturbance. In 1990, when the IDA was reauthorized that time, it became its own category. That's also when the TBI category was added. So you look at those numbers and they all would have been under emotional disturbance before that. When you look at ethnicity, we're always told that we over-identify minority students. Interestingly, according to these numbers, we're slightly under-identifying Hispanics, over-identifying whites and blacks, and under-identifying Asians. Now, everything I just said there would be if you assumed that all people were alike. I'll leave that there. All right. Percent of students with disabilities in Texas that are on free or reduced lunch is at 66.8%. And for the general population, or for all students, it's 60%. So higher. There is a relationship or correlation between poverty and special education. Now, when we say there's a relationship, don't say I said that it causes it. I'm not saying there's a causal relationship there, but there is a correlation. I can tell you that there's also a correlation because tall kids read better than short kids. And everybody starts telling me, hey, I'm a short person. I read real well. Or my daughter's short and she reads real well. But when you think about it, the average fifth grader is taller than the average first grader, and the average fifth grader reads better than the average first grader. So there is a correlation there. It's not causal. If you're 6'8", you're not necessarily, as an adult, you're not necessarily going to read better than somebody who's 4'8". But in children, there is a correlation. So we see that correlation. You have to do some thinking and study to find out if there's a causal relationship there. Genders, in every category, there are more males served than females. But the biggest discrepancy is in the category of emotional disturbance. What many researchers say is that females actually have emotional disturbances at the same rate that males do, but the difference comes in whether they are internalizing or externalizing behaviors that are manifested from that emotional disturbance. Females tend to have internalizing behaviors, so they will sit in the back and sulk or mope or be depressed or whatever else, and usually not act out too much, while the males are more tend to have more of a acting out behaviors. Actually, I said that the ED was the most of that. Look at the difference in autism. How many are males and how many are females? STAR scores. I was in a meeting last year when the assistant principal told the group of English teachers that you need to do some study on why our special ed students do not score as well in the STAR as our non-special ed students. And me being politically correct, I said, because they're in special ed. I mean, there's a reason they're in special ed. They do not achieve. They need specially designed instruction, all of that. So yeah, it just makes sense to me that the kids who are in special ed are not going to score as well as the kids who are in the general ed capability and classroom. Four-year cohort graduation rates. Guess what? Our special ed kids do not graduate at the same rate as the regular ed. All right, so characteristics of kids with emotional disturbances. Cognitively, they are the highest IQ group of any of the special ed categories because they don't have a learning disability. They don't have an intellectual disability. If they did, then they wouldn't qualify as having an emotional disturbance when we saw that in the definition. So they cognitively are the highest average of the disability categories.
So Dr.
Unfortunately,
Clark, so if you're doing like an art or whatever, and you see a kid, they're dual coded for both an SLD and an ED, is that incorrect then?
no, that can happen, right, Lisa?
Yes, that can happen.
You're
Okay.
the evaluation person.
Yeah, that can happen. You can be LD and ED, but actually, wait, can you?
Because the ED, it said that you can't be ED if you've got another thing that's keeping you from learning. It's like if you've got a learning disability, then you can't be ED.
You cannot be ED, wait a minute, you can't be LD if ED is overriding your LD. You have to rule out ED as the primary cause of your disability if you're going to be LD.
So I've jumped back to that definition. It cannot be explained by an intellectual, sensory, or health factor, but that doesn't exclude SLD, right?
Yeah, ID and LD are different, remember?
Mhm.
ID and LD are different. So we're not talking intellect with LD,
Right.
but you still have to rule out ED as your primary cause before you can say that a child is LD.
Okay.
Okay,
Whew.
Dr. Kevin, don't we say that a student is LD if they qualify with dyslexia though?
yes,
So they can't have an emotional disturbance and dyslexia?
they can if you can rule out ED as the primary cause. But it would be
Okay.
very, very dicey to say that a child is ED and LD.
Okay, but I just wanted to know how to ensure they would get dyslexia services. If they had dyslexia, I just wouldn't want the ED to push that out of the IEP.
And that's a very tricky situation.
Okay,
It's very tricky because see, ED can mask all kinds of other things. It overrides so many things. It can mask lots and lots of things. ED can, and you've got to rule it out before you can start serving lots of other areas. Now, ED, and Clark may be going to talk about this, ED is one of those disabilities that can come and go. Are you going to talk about that at all tonight, Clark?
Wasn't planning on it.
Okay, we can talk about that, on another occasion. But ED is, a lot of most of our disabilities, once you have it, you have it. AU, autism, doesn't go away. I mean, you can remediate some of the effects of it. LD, you can remediate some of the effects of it. But truly, if you're truly dyslexic, if you truly have an LD in math, if you're truly some of those things, they don't go away. You can remediate their effects. But ED, your emotional disturbance can go away with treatment and things like that, with medication. You'll have a school. And another thing that's iffy about ED, in my opinion, having worked with lots and lots of school psychologists through the years, is that, and I hate to say this, but I'm going to go ahead and say it. It's a matter of opinion. I've worked with school psychologists who we would, and I may have already said this to my diagnostician students. I can't remember if I've said this year or not, but I've had school psychologists where we would hope that school psychologist A would be the one to evaluate this child on X campus, because we knew that school psychologist A would say yes to the ED, but school psychologist B would say no to it. And everybody else involved with the student would know that the child was ED. And we just hoped and prayed that school psychologist A would be the one to do the evaluation, because school psychologist B would say no to it. And it was just a matter of opinion and the way they conducted their evaluations. And so sometimes school psychologist A would do the initial and school psychologist B would do the reeval. And so then you'd be ED on the initial and not ED on the reeval, when we all knew that they still were ED. So this is one of those can be subject to opinion. And that's one of those things that's the downside of the way we evaluate it. It's not objective, it's subjective, and it's up to the opinion of the evaluator. As you just saw on the definition that Clark looked at a few minutes ago, over a long period of time into a marked degree. Well, what's a long period of time and what's a marked degree? Those are subjective terms, and you can make a case one way or another, depending upon who you are as a psychologist and what your bent is.
Yeah.
Okay,
Dr.
Clark,
Kevin,
which
sorry.
Dr. Kevin? He or she?
both of you.
Okay,
So tomorrow I have an ARD on a little girl. First of all, we have a unicorn here. So it's a little girl. She's SLD, ED with dyslexia. And so she's a 5th grader. So I think her behavior was worse before, because when I talked to her teacher, I said, are you making any changes to her BIP? And she's like, oh, she really doesn't even need that BIP, but we are going to adjust it a little. But really with the supports that she has, she's doing so well now that you wouldn't really even know that she's ED. So I think this is one of those cases that when she's reevaluated, that might, I mean, she may not requalify ED.
and I would think you would need to get rid of that label. That would be my opinion. You don't want that on there if it doesn't apply. And ED is not one of those that I would want to keep, as people say, a safety net. We're going to keep that as a safety net. You don't want to keep it as a safety net if they don't need that. That's not one of those that you want as a safety net. Any other questions before we go on? Okay, Clark, go ahead.
Okay, so characteristics, we
great questions,
find that
Clark.
they real often have holes in their academics, language, social skills, and here's a lot of the reason. Start over at the far right. They misbehave. They get a discipline referral. They're removed from class. While they're removed from class, they're missing instruction, sitting in the office or whatever, or they're on campus suspension, whatever. They're out of the class. So they miss the instruction on that concept. They don't grasp the concept. It's way better to be bad than be stupid. So they misbehave again. They get another discipline referral. So they've spent a whole lot of their school time not in the class receiving instruction, which causes all sorts of holes in their academics. Their language skills typically are not as good as as their peers. They need social skills, and we're going to talk more about that. And of course, they have behavior deficits. What is that? All right, so interventions, positive behavior supports, academic interventions, behavior interventions, social skills training, and then placement options. We're going to talk about all these in a little bit of detail. PBIS, positive behavior support, interventions and supports, is a federally mandated, and then state Texas has the PBIS that you need to be trained in. They actually have an online course now. But positive behavior intervention supports are strategies that are employed by schools to effectively teach, encourage, and reinforce pro-social behavior in and out of the classroom. So we're pretty familiar with RTI by this point. Well, RTI for behavior should include positive behavior interventions and supports. Your general classroom rules, if you've done a good job of teaching your expectation and teaching your classroom rules, you're going to take care of 80-90% of your kids just like that. Then you're going to have a few other kids who have a little bit of problem, and they're going to need some tier 2 interventions. They're going to need some extra help, maybe some practice, some role modeling on how to follow the rules. And then once they get that, they're going to be okay. And then you've got that other 1%. You notice a lot of times in here, I have emotional and behavioral disorder students. There's no such category in the state of Texas as a behavior disorder, but we know that we have kids who have behavior issues, and those kids may or may not have an ED label, but they still are behavior problems, and they have that behavior disorder type problem. Whether it's labeled or not, they're a problem for the teachers in the school. So a system like this needs to be included. Every school is teaching this and should be following it. You focus on prevention, on early intervention, on teamwork, where all adults are working with the students, what we might call wraparound service, working on meeting the students' needs and building a positive school climate and more. This has gotten especially big with the whole idea of bullying and school violence. So we talked about the academic gaps. They have learning gaps for missing instructions. There's a big correlation with our kiddos and transferring schools, whether things get so bad at one school, mom just says, I'm taking you out of this school. Or I had a student earlier this year, mom said, hey, I'm tired of messing with you. You're going to go live with dad. He lives in a different school district. And so they transfer schools often, or the parent gets tired of messing with the school and they say, okay, we're just going to homeschool him. And then he goes home and he plays on his Xbox while everybody else is at school. And then after a while, they decide he needs to come back to school or go to a different school. They also have gaps from just not paying attention in class. And sometimes that's externalizing behavior. They're too busy minding everybody else's business and not their own. But sometimes you don't see it, especially with our female students, because they've got this internalized behavior crisis going on within them where they can't pay attention to what's going on. You may think they're there, but they're zoned out. And so you have all these learning gaps from lack of educational opportunity caused by all of these different things that we have listed there. Academic interventions might include a modified delivery system. We're finding that some of the kids that don't do well in class are doing okay with the computer instruction. Others don't do it well at all with it. Some of them are going to need extra time. Some of them are going to need more individual attention. Almost all of them are going to need more individual attention. There's some success that they've seen with peer tutoring, especially with older kids working with younger kids. So not same age tutoring as much as the other. And then the textbook talks about other interventions that may need to happen. Behavior interventions may include the consideration of a less restrictive environment that's appropriate for that student's needs. When IDEA came out and said, we don't want to have all kids in the least restrictive environment, everybody decided, okay, we need to do away with our special ed classes. And we did what I call main dumping. We just started dumping every kid into regular ed class. Well, that doesn't work for all kids. And so we need to be sure that we're meeting the need of our particular kid with an emotional behavior disorder in the environment that works for him. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. Then reinforcers. These can be tangible. If I give you a pat on the back, if you like a pat on the back, or I tell you great job or high five or something like that. That's a social type thing. A tangible reward would be here's a candy bar, you've done great. And then what I think really works better are token or semi-token economies, where you earn in tokens, you earn an actual token. So that's good for kids that need to see it. When the kids get a little older, then they can keep it on a point sheet, and it makes it much easier to keep up with. But then it only works if they can trade those points or those tokens for something they want. So I try to have a variety of things for them to earn with their points. Big right now, big always is candy and those sorts of things. Big right now is monkey noodles. If you're not familiar with monkey noodles, they're kind of a fidget type thing, kind of a cross between a fidget spinner and Stretch Armstrong. That dates me, doesn't it? Punishers. In behavioral terms, a punisher is something that makes the behavior less likely to recur. So that could be anything from planned ignoring to anything that the kid dislikes to the point that they won't do the behavior again because they don't want that to happen. They definitely need social skills training. And when we get into the question, what about medication? You're a teacher, you're not a medical doctor, you're an educator, you're not a medical doctor, you're not prescribing medication. You can't tell mom, you got to get that kid on ADHD pills, or he can't come back to school. You can't do anything like that. If you have a good rapport with the parents and they bring up medication, they may want to know what you see at school when the kid is on medication or not on medication. One of the kids that I'm working with right now has got an eating problem. Ever since he had COVID, things don't taste right to him. He's just basically refusing to eat. And because of that, he has no energy. I mean, you take a 12-year-old kid that's not eating, and he has just no energy, wants to just sleep at school. So mom told me that she was going to take him off of one of his medications in the morning that was to help him calm down. And I noticed the next day after she told me she was going to do that, that he was much more high strung, much more hyperactive. But he was able to stay awake a little better. So, if mom's asking about that, sure, you can tell her what you're seeing, but don't ever get yourself into a situation where you're diagnosing and prescribing medication. Not only can you get yourself fired, but you can also end up with your school district paying for the medications. Social skills, they need to be taught directly, just like you're going to teach the Pythagorean theorem or whatever other skill that they need to learn. Most kids kind of catch on to social skills by osmosis. Like we said, 80 or 90% of them are going to get it. But these kids need it taught directly to them. This is how it works. And this is what you're supposed to do. There are lots of commercial, well, not lots, but there are a couple of really popular commercial programs out there, like the Boys Town model and Goldstein's skill streaming model that break down, especially a task analysis. For example, you want to get the teacher's attention, look at the person, raise your hand, wait for acknowledgement, state your request politely. So that's how they break down skills. And there's 30 skills or something that they break down, but 16 main ones. And then
That's really
others.
interesting, Dr. Cavan, that they're teaching them that in that way, like to get someone's attention, you need to look at them. I can see why they would have lumped it with autism at one point or had autism lumped with them, because that's the sort of thing you have to teach a lot of kids with autism.
Right. And every Boys Town skill starts with look at the person. Every skill streaming skill starts with make eye contact. So, and then you talk to, okay, why would you need to look at the person before raising your hand? Well, if the teacher's looking at somebody else, then you're going to be there a long time with your hand up, and it's, you're wasting your time. So these skills, if they're just taught and not practiced and not explained, then it can be problematic. Should be taught in context. So after you've taught it directly, then you'll teach it in context. You're teaching along, some kid hollers out, hey, that would have been a great time to raise your hand, and here's why. Now let's practice. Should be taught the applicability and the modification of the social skills for various settings. When I work with kids in high school, that are getting a job. I had a kid that got a job at Pizza Hut. And I said, okay, when you need to get your boss's attention, how do you get the boss's attention? Look at the person, raise your hand. No, you're at Pizza Hut, you're working, you're not going to raise your hand. So we talk through it. You still look at them, but then you'll probably walk up to them, or when they get through talking to somebody else, hey, boss, or something like that. So how to modify these for other settings. Let the kids practice through role play, and then consistently teach and reinforce these skills throughout the day. Placement options, you need to make sure that you're continuing to consider the full continuum of services. You want this kid to get the free appropriate public education that he's entitled to under IDEA, but you've got to figure out what's appropriate for that child. A lot of people want to make this decision based on how it affects other kids. Well, you don't really have that option. You have the option of how does it affect this child? What works for this child? Do you want them in a general education classroom without any support? Maybe the general ed class with support. Maybe they need the special ed classroom part of the day. Maybe the special education classroom full day. But think about all these things. These are the same things you're considering with the kid who has an intellectual disability or learning disability. It's based on what they need academically more so than what they need for behavior. You go on to look at a special school, or maybe even a special classroom within a special school. You may end up with an alternative educational placement. This could be an AEP or a disciplinary AEP that your school offers. It could be a day school or even a residential treatment facility. Now, if your art committee determines that this child needs to be served in a residential treatment facility, you are committing your district to pay for that residential treatment facility for that child. There are some school districts that have decided it's worth it. I will pay for that to get them out of here. Read about a district in Chicago that was sending their troubled kids to a residential treatment facility in Arizona that to work on their behavior and continue their academics. And then they can end up with in the juvenile justice AEP. They came out a number of years ago, and basically if you have a district, a county of any size, I can't remember what the number is right now, but if it's a good sized county, then they have to offer a JJAEP. And then instead of a child being expelled from school, they can't be expelled. They can only be sent to that JJAP instead of being expelled to the street.
For some reason, I'm thinking it's 50,000 or more. Am I right about
Okay.
that? Does that sound familiar?
Yeah, I don't remember. I was thinking it was somewhat more than that, but you may be right.
I may be wrong. That number just came to my head. How we doing on time? I'm showing
It's
8 o'clock.
Yeah, I'm almost through.
Okay.
You want me to stop now? Or?
No, go, if you're almost through, go ahead.
Okay. You took my time. It's not my fault. By federal special education law, this is not considered a restricted placement. Some people think, okay, this kid went to TYC. That's a very restricted placement. Actually, it's not a restricted placement because it's not an educational placement. He was adjudicated to that setting. Then within the setting, he would get the full, there should be the continuum of services, and there would be the decision made there at the facility. There are special ed teachers, diagnosticians, all these people are employed by the Texas Youth Commission, and they even have a special ed director, all of that. And the kids there have the same opportunities as far as the special education continuum. Then if they're adults and still are being educated, then they're served by the Wyndham School District, which is the Texas Department of Criminal Justice school district, and the special education laws continue to apply. So you think about kids who are 18 and haven't graduated. Well, they're still entitled to their education. All right, last couple of things. We know that PL 94-142 was signed by Gerald Ford in 1975. Interestingly, when he signed it, he said, "I'm signing this because it's the right thing to do, but we can't afford it." And the federal government has proceeded to show that they can afford it, and they're not fully paying for their part of it. Never have, and I don't think ever will. It was reauthorized in 1990, then reauthorized again in 92. In 1990 is when they moved autism into its own category. Reauthorized in 92, and then said, okay, we're going to reauthorize it every 5 years from here on out. So they reauthorized it again in 97, which was 5 years, then 7 years later in 2004, and it has not been reauthorized since then. It should have been done in 2009, and it still hasn't been done. Certainly, you got to be aware of Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 and the Americans with Disabilities Act. All of these tie into our students with disabilities. Don't forget FERPA. I was in a school the other day. The mom of a kid who is severely autistic came in, and the paraprofessional started talking to her about, well, sometimes he gets upset, and when he gets upset, it just really scares little Lucy in here. And so afterward, I had the chance to talk to her about, you can't talk to this mom about little Lucy. That's not her kid. You got to change of placement if the kid is out for less than 10 days because of behavior, or if they're suspended over to the DAP for 45 days, then what? At that point, you've got to look at the manifestation determination review. We don't really have time to talk about that right now, but if you want to go to clarkcavanconsulting.com, I recently wrote a blog entry about that, and it might help explain some of it. Behavior intervention plan, does the kid need one? 90% of the time or more, if a kid has emotional disturbance, I would say he does need a behavior intervention plan. And then does it need to be modified? Well, if the kid gets in trouble and gets a change of placement because of that, then obviously the one you had didn't work, so it does need to be modified.
And a rule of thumb is if you don't have one, you probably need one, and when in doubt, do one.
Restraint, if you end up in a restraint situation with a child, then if you haven't been trained in crisis prevention intervention or a similar program, then within 30 days of having to do that restraint, you need to be trained. Under the PBIS, you need to know the difference between restraint, seclusion, and timeout, and when each one can be used and how it's defined. Restraint is not every time you touch a kid. Some people think, oh, you touched the kid, you restrained him. I had a situation a while back where the kid was, threw a desk at me, hit me with a chair, several other things, and I, disarmed him. He took the charger from the Chromebook and was swinging it around like a mace in the medieval weapons or a nunchuck or something. And I disarmed him, but I didn't maintain control of his body. I just held him long enough to get the weapon away from him, and that is not a restraint. If I see a kid is upset and I put my arm around the kid and guide him out the door, talking to him, that's touching for comfort. It's not a restraint. So you got to know what a restraint is. You need to be trained in restraint if you're involved in that. Seclusion is where you put a kid into a small room, and it even tells you it's less than 50 square feet, that is designed to seclude a kid. Some people say, oh, you could never do that. Well, actually you can. If the kid is in danger to self or others and help is on the way, then yes, you can seclude a kid, but it's very rare that you can get by with that without it being a major issue. And then timeout, I think we're all pretty familiar with timeout, and timeout's okay. When this first came out, they said, oh, restraint, seclusion, timeout, we're never going to be able to put a kid in timeout again. Well, yeah, as long as the facility's right and it's not a seclusion situation, you can use timeout. We've already talked about the fact that you do whatever training you diagnosticians need to do. I'm sorry, not training, but testing. But in the committee, it really comes down to there's only one guy that counts, and that's the psychiatrist, psychologist, who will make the determination whether that child has emotional disturbance or not. Wrapping it up, they can be scary. And the big problem is that a lot of times we've got a teacher coming out of college. She needs a job. The only opening is in the behavior class. We put her in there. She's there for 2 years. She gets not only out of that classroom, she gets out of education altogether because she got scared and didn't know what to do or how to handle it. So we have a teacher shortage. I want to help you to help the teachers you work with who work with emotionally disturbed kids to not become emotionally disturbed teachers. Classroom discipline is major, and we'll work on that some later on. All right, Lisa, back to you.
All right. That's all the time I want to take tonight. Anybody have any quick questions?
Okay, I know, well, it's after 8, but I want to tell you this. I just was doing our chapter 1 assignment from our other class this morning, and I was reading the Assessment of Children book by Sattler, and this stuck out to me, and I actually told my husband. It says low SES is probably the single most significant factor placing children at risk for becoming maladjusted. I was like, that is so interesting. But anyway,
It
my
makes
husband and
total
I had
sense,
this
though.
discussion. Mhm.
Yeah.
Yep.
And it's interesting because as Clark tells me about the various kids he's been working with in the last few weeks, I'll say, well, tell me a little bit about their background. And almost always it's a sad situation of poverty or of I hate the term broken home because we had two broken homes when we got married, you know.
Now we just have one.
Yeah, that's right. The one we live in, right? But so, you know, I use that term with caution, but it's kids that have troubled households, whether it be financial or marital with the parents, or, you know, environmental, you know, whatever it might be. There's abuse, neglect, harm, you know, there's crap going on at home, whatever it might be. And low SES is just one of those factors, but there's always garbage in the life of these kids. And that's why. That's all. I've heard it said, and then I've repeated this before. Parents hate this label because it's the one that you can avoid, you know. You can, parents get blamed for it. And a lot of times with good reason. It's not always their fault, not always, but a lot of times it is. A lot of times that parents can do things to keep this from happening. And sometimes it's no fault of their own, but sometimes it is their fault. And the finger gets pointed at them by school personnel. And sometimes that's a harsh reality, but it happens. And y'all can all think of a situation, I'm sure, where you've known a kid who's got that label, and you know why, because there's a crazy mama, or there's a crazy daddy, or there's a crazy grandma, or, you know, somebody's done something awful, and it's trickled down to that kid. So it's a sad situation, but we'll talk more about all that and a lot of other stuff over the next few weeks. This is a fun class, and I look forward to the next few weeks with you guys. So if you have additional questions, just send them our way. And if I can't answer it, I'll get the guru over here to do it. Okay. And we'll see you online. Thanks, y'all. I appreciate you
Thank
attending.
you.
It's more fun to do it when there's faces looking back.
So,
Thank you.
If y'all need to
Mr.
sign off, go ahead.
so I don't know, like, how do I differentiate Kevin's, like Dr. Clark?
Just call him Dr. Clark. You can call him
That
that.
almost makes you sound like Superman.
Yeah.
So, for the BIP then, how much should the diagnostician weigh in on the BIP? Should it be mostly the LSSP doing that kind of stuff?
I would think you'd mostly want the teachers who've been working with the kid. They're going to have a better
Mhm.
idea of what works and what doesn't work. But
Right.
it is good to get the input. I always feel like the diagnostician needs to have tricks up her sleeve to be able to
Mhm.
share on, have you tried this? Have you tried this? This might work. And the same with the LSSP, that they can do those same sorts of things. So I think that's one area where a committee definitely helps. And then the parent, you know, hey, what works for you at home? Now, real often, I'll admit, I'll say to a parent, okay, what are your expectations of them at home? I don't have any expectations of them at home. You know, so, well, how do you get them to do something you want them to do? I don't ask them to do anything. You know, they just do what they want to do. So when they get to school and you start asking them to do things, well, then it's a problem.
Yeah.
But
Yeah, that makes sense.
other parents, especially parents of younger kids, have things that work. And if you can get a system going where the kid does well at home, they get a ice cream date on Wednesday with mom or something like that, great. If you can work with the parents on those kinds of things. But you want to make sure, for the most part, the behavior intervention plan is something that the school has total control of, because that's where it's going to be happening.
Sounds good.
All right, folks.
Well, it was nice to meet you after all the horrible things that Dr. Kev has been saying about you in class. I'm glad to say that it doesn't seem like it's true.
She says them to my face too. It's fine.
She actually said you are her good husband. That's what she called you. It's her good husband.
Well, I'm
That's
way better
why-
than her last
that's why
husband, but
Michelle's the
that's not
favorite.
saying much.
I just have to say one more thing. Rachel, we look like the brunette and blonde versions of each other right now.
Gosh.
We do, don't we? Okay.
Y'all are
Night,
cute.
y'all. Bye.
All right, I'll see
See
y'all
y'all
on
Saturday.
Saturday. See you Saturday.
Rachel, how do you say your last name?
Pistachic. Oh, I totally
Pischochic.
got it wrong. I've known you
Okay.
this long and I still got it wrong.
Oh, it's
Pischochic.
okay. People have known me my whole life and still get it wrong. So
I saw you spell it out in the discussion board, but I still wasn't sure. I was Pischochic.
Pischa.
Oh.
Cha. Cha. Pischa.
You say it, Rachel. I don't trust her.
Pischochic. Yeah, no, she's right. Pischochic.
Pischochic.
Pischochic. So both of the C's are CHs.
Yes.
Pischochic.
Interesting.
Okay.
Pischochic. I know how to say it.
What's going on?
All right.
All right. Good night, y'all.
I
Night.
Thank you, Clark. I'll see you
All
on
right.
Friday.
Love you. See you Friday.
All right. See you Friday. Bye. See y'all Saturday.